In this particular video, we're going to review topics from Unit 1, Lesson 1, Introduction to Living Things. I'm in the Science Fusion book, Diversity of Living Things. And if you're following along in your book, I'm starting on page 4. Our essential question for this lesson is, what are living things? So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the necessities of life and all the characteristics that all living things share. So let's look at the first question. What characteristics do living things share? If you're following along in the book, we're starting on page 6 under the blue heading. What characteristics do living things share? First of all, living things that exist on Earth may seem very different, but they're alike in several ways. There are 5 characteristics that all living things share. All living things are made of one or more cells. A cell is a membrane-covered structure that contains all of the materials necessary for life. This is what we've studied in the first 9 weeks. Cells are the smallest unit of life, which means they're the smallest structure that can perform life functions. What characteristic do living things share? Most cells are so small they cannot be seen without a microscope. The microscope is a tool that we use in the laboratory to see cells or see things that are too small for the naked eye to see. The membrane that surrounds a cell separates the cell's contents from its environment. Unicellular or one-celled organisms are made up of only one cell. Multicellular organisms are made up of more than one cell. Some multicellular organisms have trillions of cells that usually perform specialized functions. Humans are one of these multicellular organisms. All living things have the ability to sense change in their environment and respond to that change. A change that affects the activity of an organism is called a stimulus. A stimulus is something that stimulates you to change your environment. It could be letting you know that you're cold so that you move to a warmer environment, or letting you know that you're too warm and causing you to sweat to cool you off. A stimulus can be gravity, light, sound, a chemical, hunger, or anything else that causes an organism to respond in some way. Conditions inside an organism's body must stay relatively constant. Chemical reactions keep an organism alive and can happen only when conditions are exactly right. An organism must maintain stable internal conditions to survive. This maintenance is called homeostasis. This allows all organisms to maintain these stable internal conditions. They do this through the stimulus that either they're too hot or too cold, too bright, not bright enough. Organisms make other organisms through the process of reproduction. When organisms reproduce, they pass copies of all or part of their DNA to their offspring. DNA, or short for deoxyribonucleic acid, is the genetic material that controls the structure and function of cells. DNA is found in the cells of all living things. Offspring share characteristics with their parents because they receive DNA from their parents. Living things reproduce using sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. 2 parents produce offspring that share the characteristics of both parents through a process called sexual reproduction. Each parent receives part of its DNA from each parent. If you're following along, I'm on page 8 in your textbook. Most animals and plants reproduce using sexual reproduction. A single parent that produces offspring that are identical to the parent happens through a process called asexual reproduction. Each offspring receives an exact copy of the parent's DNA. In this particular process, there aren't 2 parents, and 2 parents are not sharing the DNA that make up the offspring. That offspring is an identical copy of the parent. Most unicellular organisms and some plants and animals reproduce using asexual reproduction. 2 methods of asexual reproduction are binary fission and budding. A unicellular organism splits into 2 parts during binary fission. During budding, a new organism grows on the parent organism until it's ready to separate. Living things need energy to carry out the activities of life. Energy allows these organisms to make or break down food, to move materials into and out of cells, and to build cells. Energy also allows organisms to move and interact with each other. Plants convert energy from the sun into food or glucose, which they store into their cells until they need to use it. Organisms that cannot make their own food must eat other organisms to gain energy. Some eat plants, others eat animals. Organisms that cannot make their own food are called consumers. The ones that eat plants are called omnivores. The ones that eat animals are called carnivores. Organisms such as fungi break down decaying material to gain energy. They are called decomposers. All living things grow during some period of their lives. When a unicellular organism grows, it gets larger and then divides, forming two cells. This happens using binary fission. When a multicellular organism grows, the number of cells in its body increases and the organism just gets bigger. How does a bird develop and change as it grows? So we need to look at what living things need to survive. Almost all organisms need water, air, food, and a place to live in order to survive. If you're following along in your text, I'm on page 10. Water is essential for life. Cells are mostly made of water, and most chemical reactions in cells require water. Air contains gases that organisms need to survive. Cells use oxygen in air to release energy from food. Organisms such as plants use the carbon dioxide in air to make food, or glucose. This is through a process called photosynthesis. Food provides organisms with the energy and nutrients that they need to survive. A place to live protects these organisms from harm and contains the other necessities of life. Organisms often compete for food, water, and the best place to live. So how do living things get food? On page 11 in your text. Food gives living things the energy and nutrients they need to perform life's processes. Nutrients include carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Fruits, vegetables, and grains provide carbohydrates. Nuts and fats provide lipids. Meats, nuts, and vegetables provide proteins. Producers, such as plants and algae, make their own food. Plants and algae use energy from the sun to make food or glucose. Consumers, such as deer, mice, and eagles, eat other organisms. That's how they get energy. Decomposers, such as worms and fungi, break down dead organisms or waste to get food. They return nutrients that plants can use to the soil. How do different